Pluto has spent its entire existence at the edge of every category humans have tried to put it in. Discovered in 1930, celebrated for over 7 decades as the solar system's 9th planet, then formally reclassified as a dwarf planet in 2006 by the International Astronomical Union in a vote still argued over by astronomers today. It sits so far out that sunlight takes over 5 hours to reach it, orbits at an angle steeply tilted from every other planet's path, and wasn't seen up close by any spacecraft until 2015, the last of the 9 originally recognized planets to be visited at all. A claim circulating in some corners of the internet says the Book of Enoch, a text genuinely excluded from the Western Bible in 364 CE and preserved for over 1,000 years by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, already described this distant world, calling it the place where one particular watcher was cast beyond the order of the other gates, exiled to a boundary the text says answers to no other light. This video checks that claim directly against what Enoch's astronomical book actually contains, and against what NASA's New Horizons mission genuinely confirmed about Pluto. Before we go further, subscribe now if this kind of textual and historical exploration is what you are here for. Every week this channel examines ancient texts, scholarly debates, and the interpretive questions that mainstream discourse sometimes leaves at the edge. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. What's real about the Enoch manuscript tradition? Enoch's exclusion from the Western canon is documented history, most concretely marked at the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE, and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church really is the reason a complete text survives today, preserved continuously in Ge'ez for over 1,000 years, with only fragments of the Greek and Aramaic witnesses later recovered from Qumran after 1947. The astronomical book, chapters 72 through 82, really is considered among the oldest sections of 1st Enoch, built around 12 gates governing the sun and moon's yearly cycle in a 364-day calendar. What isn't established is a passage describing an exiled watcher cast to a boundary beyond the recognized order, marking a 9th or outermost gate the text refuses to number the same way as the rest. No published critical edition of the astronomical book, Ge'ez, Aramaic, or Greek, contains this material. The real chapters 72 to 82 describe 12 gates for the sun and moon specifically. They contain no scheme of individually assigned outer planetary boundaries beyond what's visible to the naked eye, and 3rd century BCE cosmology had no concept of a body this distant to describe in the first place. Pluto is roughly 1,600 times fainter than the dimmest object visible without a telescope, and wasn't detected by any instrument until Clyde Tombaugh's photographic plates in 1930. A claim built on paraphrased, unattributed language, a gate that answers to no other light, details most translators allegedly miss, without naming a specific verse in a real published edition, isn't something a viewer can check, and that's worth treating as a signal on its own, independent of how well the surrounding astronomy holds up. Pluto's discovery and its contested status. The real history here is worth telling straight. Percival Lowell, the astronomer whose observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona would eventually find Pluto, spent years searching for a hypothesized Planet X, believing gravitational irregularities in Uranus and Neptune's orbits pointed to an undiscovered massive planet beyond them. Lowell died in 1916 without finding it. Clyde Tombaugh, a 24-year-old assistant at Lowell Observatory with no formal astronomy degree, finally spotted Pluto in February 1930 by comparing photographic plates taken weeks apart, looking for anything that had shifted position against the fixed stars. Ironically, the gravitational irregularities that motivated the search turned out to be measurement errors. Pluto's actual mass, later determined to be roughly 0.2% of Earth's, is far too small to have caused the orbital effects Lowell was chasing. He found a real object while searching for a phantom one. Pluto held the title of 9th planet for 76 years before a 2006 vote by the International Astronomical Union created a formal definition of planet that Pluto didn't meet. Specifically, the requirement that a planet must have cleared its orbital neighborhood of other debris, something Pluto hasn't done, sharing its region of the solar system with countless other Kuiper Belt objects. The decision remains genuinely contested among astronomers. Alan Stern, the principal investigator of the New Horizons mission that would eventually visit Pluto, has argued publicly and repeatedly that the 2006 definition is scientifically inconsistent, since it would technically disqualify some already recognized planets under certain orbital conditions. This isn't a fringe objection, it's a real ongoing disagreement within professional planetary science about how to define the category at all, not a settled question with one obviously correct answer. The vote itself is worth understanding as a real historical event, rather than an abstract footnote. It happened at the IAU's General Assembly in Prague, and by the time the final resolution came to a vote, a large portion of the roughly 10,000 astronomers who belonged to the organization had already left the conference, meaning the actual definition that reclassified Pluto was decided by a few hundred remaining members rather than a broad consensus of the field. That procedural detail is part of why the decision has never fully settled the argument. Critics have pointed to the low turnout as a real reason to treat the vote as less authoritative than it's often presented, while supporters argue the scientific reasoning behind the cleared its orbit criterion stands on its own regardless of how many people were in the room to approve it. Pluto itself, of course, was entirely unaffected by any of this. The debate is about human classification systems, not about anything that changed on the object itself. What New Horizons actually found? NASA's New Horizons spacecraft, launched in January 2006, traveled for 9.5 years and roughly 3 billion miles before its closest approach to Pluto on July 14, 2015, the fastest spacecraft ever launched from Earth, still moving at over 14 kilometers per second when it passed. Because of the immense communication distance, involving a one-way radio delay of over 4 hours, the entire close flyby was pre-programmed. Mission controllers had no ability to react in real time to anything the spacecraft encountered. It took over a year for New Horizons to transmit its full data back to Earth at the slow bit rates possible across that distance. The mission's timing carries its own real irony worth including. New Horizons launched in January 2006 while Pluto still officially held planetary status. The IAU's reclassification vote happened just 7 months later, in August of that same year, while the spacecraft was already en route. Alan Stern has often noted publicly that the mission was conceived, funded, and launched specifically as humanity's first close look at the ninth planet, and reached its target only after that designation had already been formally revoked, meaning New Horizons spent 9.5 years traveling to visit a planet that had, by the time it got there, had been officially reclassified as something else, a genuinely strange piece of institutional timing that had nothing to do with the mission's scientific value. What it found reshaped how planetary scientists think about small, icy worlds. Pluto's surface includes a massive, heart-shaped bright region informally called Tombaugh Regio, after its discoverer, and within it, a vast plain called Sputnik Planitia, a basin roughly the size of Texas, filled with nitrogen, carbon monoxide, and methane ice, broken into irregular polygonal cells that scientists have identified as evidence of slow convection, the ice itself rising, cooling, and sinking in a pattern remarkably similar to a lava lamp, driven by heat escaping from below. That convection pattern was itself a genuine surprise. Before New Horizons, most models expected Pluto's surface to be geologically dead, far too cold and small to have any internal activity left after billions of years. Sputnik Planitia's exact position on Pluto's surface, sitting almost precisely opposite Charon, Pluto's largest moon, led researchers to a genuinely striking inference. A mass concentration that large, in that specific location, is best explained if a liquid water ocean exists beneath Pluto's icy crust, its extra density reorienting the whole dwarf planet over geological time until the basin settled into its current position, facing directly away from Charon. This remains a modeled inference rather than a directly measured fact. No instrument has drilled through Pluto's crust, but it's taken seriously enough in the planetary science literature that a subsurface ocean is now considered a plausible, if unconfirmed, feature of Pluto's interior. New Horizons also photographed what appear to be cryovolcanoes, Wright Mons and Picard Mons. Mountain scientists believe may have erupted not molten rock but slushy mixtures of water ice, ammonia, and other compounds, a process called cryovolcanism that remains only partially understood, since the composition and eruption mechanism proposed for these features doesn't match any process observed directly elsewhere in the solar system with this level of confidence. Pluto's atmosphere and its strange seasonal cycle. Pluto has a thin, genuinely dynamic atmosphere, composed mostly of nitrogen with traces of methane and carbon monoxide, and it behaves unlike any planetary atmosphere closer to the Sun. Because Pluto's 248-year orbit is highly eccentric, its distance from the Sun varies dramatically across a single year, and as it moves farther out, its already thin atmosphere is believed to partially freeze and fall to the surface as frost, then sublimate back into gas as Pluto approaches perihelion again, an entire atmosphere cycling between gas and solid ice on a multi-century rhythm. New Horizons found the atmosphere extending much farther from Pluto's surface than pre-flyby models predicted, and detected layers of atmospheric haze arranged in dozens of distinct bands, a structure atmospheric scientists still don't have a complete explanation for. Ground-based observations since the flyby have added another genuinely surprising layer to this picture. Astronomers tracking Pluto's atmosphere by watching it briefly block the light of distant stars, a technique called stellar occultation, have found that its atmospheric pressure roughly tripled between the 1980s and the mid-2010s, even as Pluto moved farther from the Sun during that period, the opposite of what simple seasonal freezing models would predict on their own. Researchers generally attribute this to a lag between Pluto's actual distance from the Sun and its surface temperature catching up to that change, since different regions of frozen nitrogen respond to shifting sunlight at different rates depending on latitude and local terrain. But the exact modeling of how and when Pluto's atmosphere will begin thinning again as it continues moving away from the Sun remains an active, unresolved question, one researchers are still refining with each new occultation observation. Charon in the true binary system. Charon, Pluto's largest moon, is unusually large relative to its parent body, roughly half Pluto's diameter, the biggest moon-to-planet size ratio of any body in the solar system considered a planet or dwarf planet. That ratio is large enough that Pluto and Charon's shared center of mass, the point they both actually orbit, sits in open space between them rather than inside Pluto itself, technically making the pair a binary system rather than a planet with moon in the ordinary sense. Both bodies are also mutually tidally locked, meaning Pluto and Charon each always show the same face to the other, a genuinely rare configuration verified directly by New Horizons imaging. Pluto has 4 additional, much smaller moons, Styx, Nix, Kerberos, and Hydra, discovered by the Hubble Space Telescope between 2005 and 2012, several of which tumble chaotically rather than rotating predictably, their spins disrupted by the combined, competing gravitational influence of the Pluto-Charon binary itself. What is established and what remains unverified? What can be independently verified? Enoch's canon exclusion, its Ethiopian preservation, and the astronomical book's status as an early section are documented history. Pluto's 1930 discovery, its contested 2006 reclassification, New Horizons' 2015 flyby and its findings, Sputnik Planetia's convecting ice, the inferred subsurface ocean, the cryovolcano candidates, the seasonal atmospheric cycle, and the Pluto-Charon binary system are all real, peer-reviewed planetary science. What is not established, no version of the astronomical book, in any published critical edition, contains a passage describing an exiled watcher, an unnumbered outer gate, or a boundary that answers to no other light. The real astronomical book's 12-gate system concerns the sun and moon across a calendrical year. It has no equivalent for a body this distant, faint, or small, and the underlying astronomy required to detect Pluto at all didn't exist until photographic technology and systematic sky surveys were developed in the 20th century, over 2,000 years after the astronomical book was likely composed. None of this makes Pluto less compelling, a small, icy world at the edge of what we've historically called the planets, showing active geology nobody expected, hiding a possible ocean beneath ice cold enough to freeze its own atmosphere solid every few centuries, locked in a genuine binary dance with an oversized moon, is already one of the more surprising stories to come out of planetary exploration in the last decade, discovered by a young assistant hunting for a planet that turned out not to exist, and finally seen up close only after a 9.5-year journey across 3 billion miles. And it doesn't make the astronomical book less worth studying either, a genuinely old, genuinely unusual section of scripture that tells us something real about how a Second Temple-era community understood order, time, and the visible heavens, entirely on its own historical terms. The honest version of this story is 2 real, separately remarkable subjects, a preserved ancient manuscript, and a small world New Horizons spent 9 years reaching just to photograph for a matter of hours, that this particular retelling connected with a passage that isn't actually there. The primary sources for both halves of this story remain fully open to anyone. Isaac's, Nibbs, and Nicholsberg's editions of Enoch are published and available through any research library. NASA's New Horizons mission data, including the full photographic record of the 2015 flyby, is public record, openly archived for anyone to examine directly. Neither subject needs the other's help to be worth genuine attention. It's worth closing on the same pattern this channel keeps returning to, since by now it should be recognizable rather than surprising each time it appears. A real, obscure ancient text most viewers have never read a translation of gets paired with a real, dense cluster of legitimate modern discoveries most viewers have only encountered as headlines or documentary narration, findings that are already remarkable enough on their own to hold attention without embellishment. What connects the two, every time this pattern shows up, turns out to be paraphrased, unattributed language that sounds like it's quoting something specific, while never pointing to a verse a viewer could go check for themselves. The astronomy survives that check completely intact. The textual bridge, checked directly against the real manuscripts, doesn't. This documentary examines historical, textual, and scientific topics for educational purposes only. Enoch's manuscript history and the planetary science discussed here, Pluto's discovery, its 2006 reclassification debate, and New Horizons' 2015 findings are documented in peer-reviewed scholarship and NASA mission data. The exiled watcher passage, discussed in some popular retellings, could not be located in any published critical edition of the astronomical book. Viewers are encouraged to consult primary manuscript editions and peer-reviewed planetary science before drawing conclusions.